He called her Snow White, his beautiful wife with fair skin and dark hair. But their fairy tale marriage was about to become a nightmare. Greeley, Colorado, was a peaceful town, the kind of place where families thrived in close-knit communities, and neighbors greeted one another with warmth. It was here that Heather Garraus met Ignacio, a man whose charm and lively personality swept her off her feet. Their connection was instantaneous, and for Heather, it felt like stepping into a storybook romance. With her fair skin and dark hair, Ignacio affectionately called her his Snow White, a nickname that made her feel cherished in ways she hadn't before. Together, they built a life that seemed enviable to anyone looking in from the outside. Their whirlwind romance culminated in a wedding that felt like a dream. Heather and Ignacio exchanged vows in front of friends and family, promising each other a future filled with love and unwavering devotion. Ignacio began working as a law enforcement officer, while Heather excelled in her role as a credit union supervisor, where her kind demeanor earned her admiration from everyone she met. In time, their joy multiplied with the arrival of their daughter, Victoria, a moment Heather would describe as the happiest day of her life. She embraced motherhood with devotion, and Ignacio seemed every bit the attentive husband and father she had always dreamed of. But life has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. When Heather's father died of a heart attack, followed closely by her mother's battle with cancer, grief weighed heavily on her. Ignacio stood by her side at first, offering comfort and support, but over time, his presence grew distant. Heather, caught in the haze of her sorrow, didn't immediately notice the small cracks beginning to form in their life together. The late nights at work, the unexplained absences, and the hushed mentions of a co-worker named Shawna Nelson seemed inconsequential to her then. Shawna, married herself and disillusioned with her own life, had started to see Ignacio as more than a colleague. As Heather focused on her family, her husband's heart was quietly drifting away. The love that had once bound them seemed to lose its anchor, leaving Heather holding on tightly to a life she believed could never unravel. She clung to her trust in Ignacio, unaware of the storm brewing just out of view, one that would change everything she thought she knew about her perfect world. Heather's intuition had always been her strength, but love often masks the truth, even from those who trust their instincts the most. Ignacio, who once made her feel cherished beyond measure, began to change in subtle yet unmistakable ways. He came home later, his excuses vague, but delivered with the confidence of a man convinced he could keep his secrets. Meanwhile, Shawna Nelson, a police dispatcher with a vivacious demeanor and an unhappy marriage to Ken Nelson, a sheriff's deputy, had set her sights on Ignacio. What began as casual conversations turned into something far more dangerous. Their interactions were charged, crossing boundaries Heather never imagined Ignacio would breach. Shawna's discontent with her own life fed her obsession with Ignacio, transforming a flirtation into an overwhelming desire to possess him entirely. For Ignacio, the thrill of the affair clouded his judgment. He became ensnared in Shawna's web, caught between his duty to his family and the forbidden allure of something new. Heather's trust in her husband shielded her from seeing the growing distance between them. She believed in their shared history, their vows, and the life they had built together. Ignacio's demeanor shifted. His once bright energy dimmed, and his presence at gatherings felt hollow. Their friends noticed, but hesitated to intervene, knowing the weight of the truth would shatter Heather's already burdened heart. Shawna's obsession soon spiraled into dangerous territory. She began following Heather, lurking in grocery store parking lots and observing her every move. The sight of Heather living the life Shawna wanted was too much to bear. One day, her jealousy boiled over. Confronting Heather in public, Shawna's words were sharp and venomous, accusing her of standing in the way of Ignacio's happiness. Heather, blindsided, was left shaken and confused, piecing together the fragments of a conflict she didn't fully understand. That evening, Heather confronted Ignacio. Her voice quivered as she recounted the unsettling encounter. "Why would Shawna, someone I barely know, say those things?" she asked, searching his face for answers. Ignacio, caught off guard but unwilling to confess, dismissed the confrontation as the delusions of a woman infatuated with him. "It's nothing, Heather," he assured her, masking his guilt behind a calm exterior. "I'll handle it." But Shawna's fixation didn't fade. If anything, Ignacio's rejection fueled her obsession further. She continued to insert herself into Heather's life in ways that were impossible to ignore, leaving Heather to wrestle with the gnawing shadows of doubt. Though Ignacio insisted there was nothing to worry about, Heather couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker was unfolding. Without realizing it, she had become the center of Shawna's dangerous fixation, a pawn in a game where love had warped into something terrifying and uncontrollable. Shawna's obsession with Ignacio was no longer a secret she kept to herself. It consumed her entirely, turning her every thought into a relentless pursuit. The idea of losing him to Heather was unbearable, an affront she refused to accept. What had once been infatuation had metastasized into a toxic rage. Her jealousy, fed by Ignacio's attempts to pull away, boiled into uncontrollable bitterness, pushing her actions to dangerous extremes. Heather, oblivious to the depth of Shawna's fixation, clung to the fragments of her life with Ignacio. Her love for their daughter, Victoria, became her refuge, the one constant that gave her strength. But Shawna's presence loomed like a shadow, creeping closer with every passing day. She appeared wherever Heather went, restaurants, grocery stores, even casual errands, always lingering just far enough away to avoid direct confrontation, but close enough to ensure her presence was felt. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, a psychological game meant to unsettle and intimidate. For Ignacio, the affair had become a nightmare. The thrill was long gone, replaced by the suffocating weight of Shawna's demands. She began issuing ultimatums, threatening to expose everything if he didn't leave Heather. Ignacio, desperate to salvage what remained of his family, tried to end the affair, but Shawna refused to let go. Her messages grew more volatile, her late-night voicemails laced with threats and desperation. On one occasion, she even showed up unannounced at their doorstep, her demands escalating into scenes Heather could no longer ignore. Ignacio tried to explain them away, but the cracks in his story were becoming too large to patch. Shawna's thoughts turned darker still. She confided in her best friend, Michelle Moore, pouring out her fantasies of eliminating Heather. At first, Michelle dismissed her words as the rants of a scorned lover, but Shawna's intensity soon became undeniable. Shawna began frequenting shooting ranges, her gunshots punctuated by whispered fantasies of revenge. Heather wasn't just a rival in Shawna's mind. She was an obstacle to be obliterated. Meanwhile, Ignacio's betrayal began to seep beyond the walls of their home. The affair became an open secret, whispered about among co-workers and acquaintances. Heather, still in the dark about the full extent of Shawna's involvement, started noticing the way people looked at her, pity in their eyes. The final blow came when a stranger approached her in a grocery store, shattering the illusion entirely. "Do you know Shawna Nelson had Ignacio's baby?" the woman asked, her voice a mix of pity and disbelief. Heather's chest tightened, the world spinning as the words sank in. That night, Heather confronted Ignacio. Her voice, usually steady, trembled with heartbreak as she demanded the truth. There was no escape for Ignacio. The years of lies weighed down on him, and he finally confessed to the affair, to Shawna's pregnancy, to the secrets he had buried to protect himself. Heather's devastation was visceral. The man she had trusted with her life had betrayed her in every possible way. Despite the betrayal, Heather made a decision born of love for her daughter. She chose to stay, not because she forgave Ignacio, but because she couldn't bear to break Victoria's home. But there would be conditions. Ignacio had to sever all ties with Shawna, attend counseling, and prove his commitment to rebuilding their family. Ignacio agreed, desperate to undo the damage he had caused. Shawna, however, wasn't willing to let go. Her obsession deepened, her hatred for Heather morphing into a singular, deadly purpose. Every passing day brought her closer to the edge, her mind consumed by thoughts of vengeance. Heather's decision to fight for her family, while courageous, had unwittingly set the stage for a confrontation that would change their lives forever. Heather's determination to preserve her family had been unwavering, but the relentless shadow of Shawna's obsession chipped away at her resolve. Every effort to move forward with Ignacio felt like climbing a mountain, only to be dragged down by a new wave of torment. Shawna, seething with rage, intensified her harassment. The taunting texts, cruel emails, and threatening phone calls were unrelenting. Heather became Shawna's fixation, the symbol of everything standing between her and the life she believed she deserved. When Ignacio, at Heather's insistence, officially ended the affair, Shawna's fury boiled over. Heather was there, watching with crossed arms and a heart heavy with pain, as Ignacio dialed Shawna's number. Shawna's voice erupted on the other end, her rage palpable even through the receiver. "You'll regret this," she hissed before slamming the phone down. Moments later, Heather's phone buzzed with a message. A photo of Shawna and Ignacio's son, Christian, appeared on her screen, accompanied by the chilling caption, "IG's flesh and blood." The reminder of Ignacio's betrayal was a knife twisting in Heather's heart. She tried to maintain her composure, but the constant harassment left her on edge. She parked her car in the garage, afraid Shawna might vandalize it. She glanced over her shoulder whenever she stepped outside, her unease growing with each passing day. Ignacio sought legal recourse, hiring an attorney to send Shawna a cease and desist notice, but the document did little to quell Shawna's fury. If anything, it only fueled her vendetta. Shawna's resentment festered, transforming into a singular mission: to make Heather pay. Behind the closed doors of their home, Ignacio and Heather were trying to rebuild their marriage. Counseling sessions were fraught with raw emotions: anger, sorrow, and the weight of betrayal. Heather's strength was admirable, but it came at a cost. She was fighting battles on every front, against Shawna's unrelenting torment, Ignacio's past infidelities, and her own wounded heart. Shawna, however, wasn't done. She began stalking the family. If Heather and Ignacio went out with Victoria, Shawna ensured her presence was felt, appearing at the same restaurant or parking nearby. She hovered on the edges of their lives, her gaze heavy and unyielding. Ignacio's alarm grew with each new intrusion, but Heather, emotionally exhausted, tried to focus on the small victories as they pieced their marriage back together. By January 2007, the tension was unbearable. Shawna's obsession had metastasized into pure malice. On a frigid evening, Heather left work at the credit union, eager to spend the night with Victoria. The parking lot was quiet, its dim lighting casting long shadows across the pavement. As Heather walked toward her car with a few colleagues, the night's stillness was broken by the appearance of a figure stepping out of the darkness. Dressed entirely in black, their face concealed by a grotesque Halloween mask, the figure moved with chilling intent. A gun glinted in their hand as they approached Heather. Her colleagues froze, paralyzed by shock and fear. Heather turned, her heart pounding as she instinctively backed away. "Get on your knees," the figure commanded, their voice sharp and cold. Heather hesitated for a moment before obeying, her breath hitching, her body trembling with fear. The gunman stepped closer, the barrel of the weapon now inches from Heather's head. "You ruined my life," they spat, their words laced with venom. And then they pulled the trigger. The first shot echoed through the night, a sharp crack that sent her co-workers ducking behind cars. Heather crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The gunman fired again, ensuring there was no hope of survival. The masked figure then sprinted to a red pickup truck parked nearby and sped away, leaving behind a scene of chaos and devastation. When the police arrived, the parking lot was awash with flashing lights and muffled sobs. Heather's body lay motionless, her co-workers trembling as they recounted the horror they had just witnessed. Ignacio, notified of the tragedy, rushed to the hospital, desperate for answers. But a doctor intercepted him at the trauma room doors, delivering the news that would shatter his world. "She's gone." Ignacio collapsed, the weight of his grief and guilt pressing down on him. The realization that he had to face Victoria, their daughter, and explain that her mother had been murdered was unbearable. That night, father and daughter sat together, clinging to one another as tears fell in silent torrents. Heather's absence left a void that neither time nor words could ever fill. The aftermath of Heather's murder sent shockwaves through the close-knit community of Greeley. The once peaceful town was now engulfed in fear and disbelief as police cordoned off the dimly lit parking lot, turning it into a hub of frantic activity. Witnesses recounted the harrowing details of the attack, describing the gunman as a figure cloaked in black, their face hidden by a grotesque Halloween mask. The attacker had escaped in a red pickup truck, disappearing into the night. One witness, still trembling, mentioned something peculiar about the gunman's movements, almost feminine in their gait, a detail that added a chilling layer to the unfolding investigation. Ignacio, drowning in grief and guilt, was immediately brought in for questioning. By now, his affair with Shawna Nelson was an open secret, and investigators quickly zeroed in on its relevance to Heather's murder. Ignacio admitted to his infidelity, his voice cracking as he described Shawna's relentless harassment of Heather and the threats she had made. Though his sorrow was evident, the police were methodical, probing him for any sign of direct involvement. For now, Ignacio was cleared, but his revelations pointed squarely at Shawna. Her name surfaced repeatedly as investigators pieced together Heather's final days. Shawna's erratic behavior, her obsession with Ignacio, and her overt hatred for Heather painted her as the prime suspect. An APB was issued for both Shawna and the red pickup truck witnesses had described. The town held its breath as officers combed the streets, determined to bring her in. That same evening, Shawna's husband, Ken Nelson, heard the alert over his police radio. Suspicious and uneasy, Ken began searching for his wife. His instincts led him straight to her. He found Shawna driving his red pickup truck near their home, her appearance disheveled and strange. She was wearing his socks, underwear, and pants, clothing hastily thrown on, as if in a rush to cover herself. Most unsettling of all, she was barefoot, despite the biting January cold. When Ken confronted her, she claimed she had been running errands, but her explanation rang hollow. Ken, realizing the gravity of the situation, called for backup. When officers arrived, Shawna was taken into custody. She maintained her innocence, vehemently denying any involvement in Heather's murder. But the mounting evidence told a different story. A search of Ken's truck uncovered crucial items: a Halloween mask matching witness descriptions and 2 shell casings of the same caliber as the weapon used in the murder. Investigators pressed on, their suspicions hardening into certainty. A further search near the crime scene yielded even more damning evidence. A pair of abandoned shoes traced back to Shawna with her DNA on them. It was clear she had tried to discard them in a hurried attempt to cover her tracks. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place, painting a portrait of a deliberate and calculated act fueled by obsession. The investigation extended to Shawna's home, where another disturbing clue awaited. A bathtub filled with water stood as if ready for her return, a chilling sign she may have planned to clean away any trace of her crime. Gunshot residue tests on her hands and clothing came back positive, solidifying the case against her. The investigators unearthed years of evidence: voicemail threats, text messages brimming with venom, and journal entries laced with hatred toward Heather. All of it pointed to a woman consumed by jealousy and rage. As the narrative unfolded, the community was left reeling. How could someone they knew, someone who had worked beside them, harbor such darkness? Heather, beloved by so many, had become the tragic victim of Shawna's uncontrollable obsession. And as Shawna sat in custody, steadfastly denying her guilt, the weight of her actions began to unravel before the world, a haunting reminder of how love, twisted by obsession, could lead to the most unthinkable violence. By February 2008, the once tranquil town of Greeley had transformed into the epicenter of one of the most sensational murder trials in recent history. Shawna Nelson, charged with first-degree murder, sat at the center of the courtroom drama. Her expression oscillated between defiance and denial, a woman seemingly unfazed by the gravity of the accusations against her. Yet the prosecution had a story to tell, a chilling narrative of a woman consumed by jealousy, driven by an obsessive love for Ignacio Garraus, and willing to commit the ultimate crime to remove anyone in her way. The courtroom was a stage for raw emotions, riveting testimonies, and damning evidence. The prosecution methodically presented their case, piece by piece: the Halloween mask found in Ken Nelson's truck, the matching shell casings retrieved from the crime scene, the gunshot residue on Shawna's hands, and a timeline of relentless harassment that Heather endured in the months before her murder. Witness after witness took the stand, their voices trembling as they recounted the nightmare that had unfolded in that parking lot. Heather's co-workers described the horrifying final moments of her life, painting a vivid picture of the terror Shawna had inflicted. But it was Michelle Moore's testimony that became the turning point. Once Shawna's closest confidant, Michelle had become a key witness for the prosecution. Her words gripped the courtroom as she detailed the depths of Shawna's hatred for Heather. She described Shawna's fantasies of eliminating Heather, the target practice sessions where Shawna imagined Heather in the crosshairs, and the chilling conversations where Shawna spoke openly about getting rid of her rival. The courtroom fell silent as Michelle admitted to assisting Shawna in planning the murder, her voice cracking under the weight of her own guilt. In exchange for her testimony, Michelle was offered a reduced sentence, but her betrayal of Shawna was unmistakable. The defense, desperate to create reasonable doubt, pivoted to an audacious alternative theory. They claimed that Michelle, driven by an obsessive love for Shawna, had orchestrated the murder herself to prove her devotion. Shawna took the stand, adamantly maintaining her innocence and accusing Michelle of framing her. She portrayed herself as a victim, ensnared in Michelle's web of manipulation. But her testimony rang hollow, her claims undermined by the overwhelming evidence and the prosecution's meticulous narrative. In their closing arguments, the prosecution laid bare the dark truth of Shawna's actions. They described her unrelenting fixation on Ignacio, her escalating hatred for Heather, and the premeditated nature of the crime. The evidence, they argued, painted a clear picture of a woman who had let jealousy and obsession spiral into cold-blooded murder. After weeks of testimony and just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the judge addressed Shawna, condemning her not only for the life she had taken, but for the devastation she had wrought on countless others. Shawna was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, her future reduced to the confines of a stark, unforgiving cell. Michelle Moore, despite her cooperation, was sentenced to 9 years in prison for her role in the crime. Shawna's husband, Ken Nelson, resigned from the sheriff's department amid the fallout of the scandal. Initially charged with tampering with evidence and being an accessory to murder, Ken's charges were later dropped. He divorced Shawna and moved out of state with their children, including Christian, the son Shawna had with Ignacio. Despite the horror of it all, Ken later expressed a conflicted hope that one day his children might visit their mother in prison, acknowledging the complexities of their shared past. For Heather's loved ones, the trial offered some semblance of justice, but it could never fully mend the wounds left by her loss. Ignacio, haunted by guilt, struggled to navigate life without Heather while raising their daughter, Victoria. The shadow of his betrayal loomed large, a constant reminder of the chain of events his actions had set into motion. Heather's friends and family continued to mourn her absence, cherishing the memory of a woman whose kindness and warmth had touched so many lives. The scars of her senseless murder remained, a reminder of how obsession and jealousy had stolen a life that should have been full of love and joy. The trial had concluded, but the echoes of Heather's story would haunt Greeley and those involved forever. The conviction of Shawna Nelson brought some sense of closure, but it could never heal the wounds left by Heather Garraus's brutal murder. Her death had ripped apart the lives of those who loved her, leaving a void that could never be filled. The quiet town of Greeley, once a place of serenity, carried the scars of her loss, and the ripple effects of that night in the credit union parking lot extended far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Ignacio, the man who had once been at the heart of Shawna's obsession, was left to confront the ruins of his choices. The betrayal that had sparked Shawna's wrath and set her on a path of destruction now haunted him daily. The weight of his actions bore down on him as he tried to piece together a life for himself and his daughter, Victoria. Their home, once filled with laughter and love, had become a haunting reminder of what they had lost. The echoes of Heather's presence lingered in every corner, her warmth and joy now replaced by an aching silence. For Victoria, the loss was incomprehensible. At just 9 years old, she was thrust into a world of grief and confusion, robbed of her mother in the most violent way imaginable. Ignacio tried to shield her from the horror of what had happened, but the shadows of that night were inescapable. Heather's memory became a constant in Victoria's life, a source of both comfort and pain as she grew up carrying the burden of her absence. Shawna, confined to a prison cell, had nothing but time to dwell on the consequences of her obsession. Once vibrant and charismatic, she had become a hollow shell, stripped of the control and power she had once craved. Letters written to her children were seldom answered, and the remnants of her twisted infatuation with Ignacio lingered in her heart like a haunting refrain. Her days were consumed by the echoes of her crimes, the walls of her cell, a constant reminder of the life she had destroyed. Michelle Moore, who had played her own part in the tragedy, served her time knowing she had enabled Shawna's deadly fixation. Though her testimony had earned her a reduced sentence, it could not erase the guilt she carried. Her name, too, became synonymous with one of Greeley's darkest chapters, a co-conspirator in the senseless murder of an innocent woman. As the years passed, Greeley tried to move forward, but Heather's memory remained a part of its fabric. At the credit union, her co-workers often spoke of her kindness and the light she had brought to their lives. A small memorial was placed in her honor, a quiet tribute to the woman whose life had been cut short by jealousy and rage. In 2015, tragedy struck the Garraus family once again. Victoria, now 17, was killed in a car accident. The news devastated those who had known Heather and her family, compounding the grief that had never truly faded. The loss of Victoria felt like an extension of the original tragedy, a cruel reminder of the lasting ripples caused by Shawna's actions. Ignacio, now a man who had suffered 2 unbearable losses, was left to mourn both his wife and his daughter, their lives extinguished far too soon. Heather's story became more than just a tale of a crime. It was a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked obsession and the devastating consequences of betrayal. It was a reminder of how quickly lives could unravel when love turned toxic and jealousy spiraled into violence. Though Shawna's conviction brought justice, it could never erase the pain she had caused or the lives she had forever changed. To this day, Heather Garraus' legacy stands as a haunting reminder of the fragility of human relationships and the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. Her name endures, a symbol of the happiness stolen by one woman's dangerous obsession. Her memory serves as a cautionary tale, a somber reflection of how far-reaching the consequences of one person's actions can be. To this day, Heather Garraus' story serves as a powerful reminder of how obsession and betrayal can destroy lives. Her memory lives on as a beacon of the love and kindness she brought to the world. If Heather's story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to ensure her legacy continues to raise awareness. Let's honor her memory by spreading the message of compassion and the importance of seeking help before tragedy strikes.